This lecture review video is about the 16th century Protestant Reformation. The Reformation is one of the most consequential events, not only in European history, but also in United States history, but also all of world history. It has profound effects for the world that is created after these pivotal events of the 16th century. When the century is over, the map of Europe regarding religion looks completely different than it did at the beginning of the century. At the beginning of the century, this map of Europe would be almost exclusively yellow, indicating Roman Catholic areas. The Roman Catholic Church, of course, is the prevailing and only church in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. There are, of course, Eastern Orthodox churches far to the east in parts of Eastern Europe, but also Russia and Islam in the Ottoman Empire. But Western Europe was predominated by the Roman Catholic Church. As we can see from this map, the religions of Europe fragment the continent once the century is completed. We can think about the Protestant Reformation perhaps beginning with a group of what I like to call pre-reformers. These are individuals that came before the 16th century for the most part and introduced ideas, wrote or preached about some theological concepts which are going to become more widely spread during the 16th century. Individuals that we could include in a list of pre-reformers would include Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo was from France, particularly the area of the French Alps, and his followers were known as the Waldensians. During the Middle Ages, they proclaimed a lot of similar ideas that the Protestant reformers would proclaim. Oh, they did it way back in the 12th and 13th centuries, criticizing the authority of the Pope and some of the doctrines of the Catholic Church. We also have John Wycliffe, who in the 14th century in England at Oxford was very critical of the Pope and doctrines such as purgatory, even the Mass, emphasized the importance of faith, and of course was most notable for translating much of the Bible into English for the first time. This is the Wycliffe Bible. The entirety of the New Testament was translated in large portions of the Old Testament as well. Wycliffe collected a group of followers who are very interested in his ideas, known as the Lollards. The Lollards, that was a title given to them by their enemies, as if they were simply babbling preachers who would go around saying la, 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 having nothing substantial to say. So the Lollards were traveling preachers who would bring copies of Wycliffe's Bible with them, proclaiming the scriptures. Wycliffe dies of a stroke in peace in 1384, but later on, during the Reformation, his body is dug up by his enemies, burned, and then cast into a local river. Without question, one of the most notable pre-reformers existed and operated in Bohemia. This is Jan Hus. Jan Hus was a Czech reformer who preached from the Bethlehem Chapel in Czech. He preached in the vernacular, in the common language, very critical of the Pope and the abuses of the clergy and the wealth and privileges of the Holy See. He emphasized the importance of faith in justification. Most notably, he preached in the common language. He attracts so much attention that eventually Prague is put under interdict, which is essentially the churches are shut down by the authority of the Pope. And so he is summoned for a trial, to be tried for his ideas. He is granted safe conduct and promised safety, but when he arrives at the Council of Constance, he is interrogated by church authorities. He is deemed to be a heretic, and then he is burned at the stake in 1415 outside the city of Constance. There is a memorial today to him in downtown Prague. John Huss is just definitely a forerunner of the reformers of the 16th century. A reformer and an individual who's certainly closer to the 16th century is Desiderius Erasmus, the Dutch humanist scholar, the Dutch Christian humanist scholar, who was notable for his intellect. It is often said that Erasmus lays the egg that Luther hatches. He was one of the most brilliant scholars of his time, very critical of the church. His most notable work was The Praise of Folly, which exposed the drunkenness and promiscuity and selfishness and privileges of particularly monks, and how their lifestyle was far from the holy dictates of the church. One of his most notable accomplishments was the compiling of a new Greek Testament. So notice again that he did not write the New Testament. We're not saying that he wrote this Greek New Testament, but rather using his skills as a humanist, he identified the most accurate manuscripts for each portion of the New Testament and the original Greek, compiled these together, and created this new Greek New Testament. It was the most authentic, accurate version of the New Testament the world had ever seen. And of course, this is going to be a very important original source for the reformers in the translation and commentary on the Bible. It is hard to think that you would have the Protestant Reformation without these pre-reformers, and it's almost impossible to think that the 16th century Reformation would occur without the very significant invention of Johannes Gutenberg. Gutenberg does not invent printing, but he does develop movable type, which is forming these lead casts of letters that can be composed into words, put on a wood frame, and then inserted onto the printing press. And beneath this frame, you could insert paper or parchment to produce documents, letters, and books. The first book to be printed off of the Gutenberg press was the 42-line Gutenberg Bible. This has enormous consequences for the translation of the Bible and the promulgation of the scriptures during the 16th century. Robert Estienne, a very important printer in Paris who printed a lot of Calvin's works and also a lot of the works of the reformers. Of course, a lot of the common people in Europe cannot read in the 16th century, so as a result, we see an explosion of woodcuts, pictures that proclaim the story of the gospel or are very critical of the Pope. Frequently, you get cartoons that contrast the humility and the sacrifice of Christ with the wealth and the indulgence of the Pope. The papacy itself is often portrayed as the whore of Babylon, and the gospel is proclaimed without words, but often in these pictures, highlighting the message of the reformers, and again, contrasting the papacy and the power and wealth of the Pope with the humility of the true followers of Christ. So we can begin our discussion and our review of the Reformation by starting to look at Germany and the German Reformation. Of course, the prime figure in the German Reformation is Martin Luther. Martin Luther was the son of miners in an area of Germany called Saxony, and his father had great expectation that his son would grow up to be a lawyer, which indeed he is studying to do so. But of course, he's caught in a very famous thunderstorm in which he's afraid he's going to die. And so he makes an oath, help St. Anne, I will become a monk, vowing to enter the monastery and pledge his life for the welfare of the church. And surviving the storm, he does exactly that, joining an Augustinian cloister in Erfurt, Germany. Martin Luther decides that he is going to be one of the most devout monks ever to be identified in this cloister. A very pivotal event for him after he is ordained as a priest is the celebration of his first Mass. Of course, Roman Catholic theology emphasizes that the Mass, in the event of the Mass, the bread and the wine are transubstantiated into the actual flesh and blood of Christ. And so Luther is struck by the fact that how could he as a sinner be holding the actual flesh and blood of Christ, that he is not worthy to do so. And he was very much afraid of this common image in the late medieval period of Christ with a lily extending from one ear or one side of his mouth and a sword on the other side. Even though the lily emphasized grace, Luther could only see the sword and that he was under God's pending judgment. So after he barely gets through the celebration of the Lord's Supper in this Mass, he resolves that he will be the greatest monk that there ever was. And he says, if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. All my brothers in the monastery will bear me out. If I had kept on any longer, I should have killed myself with vigils, prayers, reading, and other work. And so by depriving himself of blanket and extended fasting and translating the scriptures and praying extensively and waking up in the middle of the night and praying and whipping himself and so forth, all these things failed to give him any sense of peace regarding the salvation of his soul. He takes advantage of a critical opportunity in 1510 to represent his cloister in a journey to Rome. He hopes by a visit to the holy city that he will here find the peace and satisfaction to how to stand before a holy God and to flee from satisfy God's justice. But he is horrified by the corruption of the city, the brothels that are designated simply for priests, the corruption, the wealth. He is horrified to visit and attend Mass in Rome and hear the priests from the altar in Latin mocking the Mass. He visits many of the pivotal relics of the city, including the head of John the Baptist, and also crawls up the Scala Sancta, proclaiming a Paternoster or the Lord's Prayer on each step. After he pays his money, believing that he will release one soul from purgatory, but when he arrives at the top of the stairs, he famously says to himself, "Who knows if it is so? Who knows if it is so that all these things that the church prescribes in order to achieve salvation and peace for your soul are actually true?" As a result, his trip to Rome is a failure. He returns to his cloister and endeavors to pursue the confessional booth as an avenue for finding peace with God. And so daily, for hours, he would go before his abbot and confess sins he might have done, confess sins that he had done, confess sins that he thought he might have done, on, and but yet still he has no sense of peace for his soul. It is not until a leader of his monastery instructs him to go pursue his doctorate of theology at Wittenberg University that the turning point comes. This is when Martin Luther returns to the sources and returns to an actual study of the scriptures, bypassing all the prescriptions of the church that the Pope proclaimed in order to find salvation. And so at the University of Wittenberg, while studying and teaching at the university, Martin Luther famously experiences what is sometimes called the Tower Experience. Through his study of the Psalms, the book of Romans, and the book of Galatians, Martin Luther, of course, rediscovers through the scriptures the gospel. He proclaims, "I was seized with the conviction that I must understand Paul's letter to the Romans, but to that moment, one phrase in chapter 1 stood in my way. I hated the idea, in it the righteousness of God is revealed. I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners," because Luther only viewed himself as a sinner, could not see the grace of God in the cross. And so he hates this righteous God who punishes sinners. But at last, meditating day and night, and by the mercy of God, I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that through which the righteous live by a gift of God, namely by faith. Righteousness is not achieved by doing all these works that the medieval church had prescribed, but rather it is a gift. God descends to us and gives us his righteousness. And Luther says, "Here I felt as if I were entirely born again and had entered paradise itself through gates that had been flung open." So what Martin Luther does is rediscover the gospel, justification by faith alone, that man is not justified simply by doing all these things that the Pope or medieval church authorities recommended or required for one's salvation, but rather one is saved, one is justified simply by trusting in the righteousness of Christ as a free gift of God on the merits of Christ's sacrifice alone. Now, Martin Luther is, of course, a private, unknown figure at this time. It is a series of events in his area that is going to catapult him to international prominence. Those events begin when the cardinal in his area, in a local area, decides that he wants to purchase another church office and expand to his land holdings and, as a result, his wealth. Problem, he is already in debt. The Pope is more than willing to grant him a new title, but the Pope needs to be paid for this. And the Pope is interested in garnering more money for the construction of a new church, which eventually will become St. Peter's Basilica. And so how this is resolved is the Pope decides to issue a new letter of indulgence in which, if you purchase one of these certificates, then you could reduce or completely eliminate your time in purgatory. No confession or repentance of sins were even required, but simply by paying your coin, then you could receive a letter of indulgence and free yourself or someone else from purgatory. So it is Johann Tetzel who is given the task of selling these new indulgences in Luther's area of Saxony. And so Tetzel would travel from town to town proclaiming this new offer, exclusive offer from the Pope, and for a mere pittance, you could liberate someone from purgatory. So there was often a dramatic display in his preaching, and then at the end of his sermon, he would say, "Listen to the voices of your dear dead relatives and friends beseeching you and saying, 'Pity us, pity us. We are in dire torment from which you can redeem us for a pittance.' As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." So many residents of Saxony, many of Luther's fellow Germans, line up very quickly to pay for these letters of indulgence to free themselves or their relatives from the pains of purgatory. Luther is horrified by this teaching and preaching of Tetzel, and so leaning on his scholarship and knowledge of church history and now knowledge of the scriptures and theology, he takes up his pen and pens the very famous 95 Theses. These are 95 statements which were designed for academic debate, questioning the power of the Pope over purgatory, why the Pope doesn't release more souls from purgatory, and criticizing the efficacy of indulgences and emphasizing the importance of faith. We can't see in the 95 Theses a fully developed version of the gospel and Luther's theology. That will come later. But we certainly see here the opening salvo in an attack against the medieval church by this Protestant reformer. And so he does something very typical of the day. As a university professor, he nails the 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg to provoke academic debate. They are posted in Latin. Most people don't read Latin, but someone, we don't know who, took them down from the door and then placed them on the printing press after translating them into German. As a result, the 95 Theses spread like wildfire throughout northern Germany and other parts and quickly gain an audience. Martin Luther becomes a household name, and the German people who had often been thoroughly abused and heavily taxed by the papacy find these 95 Theses quite appealing. So in 1519, Luther begins his defense of what he is teaching at a very famous debate at Leipzig. He faces one of the best theologians and debaters of the Catholic Church, Johann Eck. And at one point in the debate, Eck asked Luther, "Do you think you alone is right and everyone is wrong? These teachings that you are offering are nothing less than the Hussite heresy, the teachings of John Huss." Luther is indignant by this charge, and at one point goes into the library at Leipzig and researches in the theological books there Huss's trial, and indeed realize he is teaching many of the same things that John Huss was offering. Realizing that there is a brush fire quickly becoming a wildfire in Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire, the Pope responds, perhaps fictionally, with the words, "It is a drunken German who wrote the Theses. When sober, he will change his mind." But his official action is to release a bull, a papal statement from the Pope, on the errors of Martin Luther, called the Exsurge Domini, in which Martin Luther has 60 days to repent or he'll be excommunicated from the church. Luther doesn't wait for the full 60 days, but rather says, since they've burned my books, I burn theirs. So far, I've merely fooled with this business of the Pope. All my articles condemned by Antichrists are Christian. Seldom has the Pope overcome anyone with Scripture and with reason, and publicly burns the bull. As a result, Martin Luther is excommunicated from the church. Luther continues to read the Scriptures and study and write. He writes 3 consequential pamphlets that begin to expand and explain the gospel, but also the fallacies of the Roman Catholic Church on the freedom of a Christian, discussion of justification by faith alone and its implications. He's starting to expand this doctrine. On the Babylonian captivity of the church, he attacked the teachings of the church regarding the sacraments and said that there are only 2 sacraments, the Lord's Supper and baptism, and not 7, as the Roman Catholic Church advocated. And to the Christian nobility of the German nation, which was a request for German leaders to bring reform to the church. It was the job of a godly prince to promote the reform of the church. Now, of course, in Luther's day, there is no Germany. The area that we call Germany today was, of course, the Holy Roman Empire, this loose collection of German states. Many of the larger states had electors, and the electors would elect an emperor. And the historic dynasty for the Holy Roman Empire was the Austrian Habsburgs, and Charles V was the emperor over much of Europe. You can see from the map that he controlled the Holy Roman Empire, areas of what we would call France and Switzerland and southern Italy and all of Spain and even the Low Countries of the Netherlands and Belgium. A very large empire. And he has this growing theological controversy in his historic lands of the Holy Roman Empire. And so Martin Luther is, of course, called to trial at Worms. When all the German states come together, they form a parliament, or what is called a diet. And at Worms in 1521, Martin Luther believes he was be given the opportunity to explain and debate his ideas. Of course, that is denied him, and he is simply asked to identify his books, and he agrees that they are his writings, and he is given one question, which is, will you recant? And finally, realizing there will be no debate, there will be no discussion, there will be no opportunity for him to defend his ideas, he delivers the very famous words in the hall, "Since then your majesty and your lordships desire a simple reply, I will answer without horns and without teeth. Unless I am convicted by Scripture and plain reason, I do not accept the authority of popes and councils, for they have contradicted each other. My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and I will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. God help me, amen. Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise." Words like that got John Huss burned almost 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, in 1415 at Constance. Now Luther stands up to the church authorities, and because he had attracted such a large popular following in Germany, the emperor and the papal legate realized that they cannot move against him with violence without incurring the wrath of the people. Luther, on his way back from Worms, expected to be attacked, arrested, burned at the stake, murdered. He is, of course, an outlaw. He's an excommunicate. But it is his prince, the Prince of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, who dispatches horsemen to kidnap Martin Luther and bring him to a remote castle at the Wartburg. This is a castle way up on the hill at Wartburg. Luther is going to spend the next several months at the highest point of the castle, secretly residing there, translating the scriptures, elaborating on the ideas he had already started to promulgate. He hated being there. He says, I can tell you in this idle solitude there are 1,000 battles with Satan. It is much easier to fight against the incarnate devil, that is, against men, than against spiritual wickedness in the heavenly places. Often I fall and am lifted again by God's right hand. I had rather burn on live coals than rot here. He is pressed each night on this question, Could he be right and everyone wrong? Could the entire medieval church be wrong and he, this one monk, be right? But he often said by re-examining the scriptures, his faith was restored. One of the most consequential things he does during his time of exile is translate the Bible into German. This is a major contribution to the German language, and he makes several linguistic contributions to the development of German. Eventually, he returns to Wittenberg and oversees the Reformation there. There are radicals that are often promoting violence that Luther has to quell and draw back. Martin Luther gets married to also a former nun, Catherine von Bora. She will bear him several children. Luther is famous for his table talk and writings about marriage and family. And in Luther's writings, we see a major shift, whereas the Middle Ages disparage marriage and disparage childbirth and also sexuality as all things that are temporal and earthly and of the flesh and not to be valued. Martin Luther celebrates all of these things as good gifts from God and things to cheer us in our walk in faith. He is also a hymn writer, writes several hymns. The most famous, of course, is A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Martin Luther is not immune to controversy. He was very famous for his scatological language in a lot of his tracts. He also endorsed the bigamous marriage of Philip of Hesse, which was a local prince. And he also wrote very disparaging things against the Jews, which the Nazis are going to use later on to justify their own anti-Semitism. But of course, Martin Luther, what he wrote about Jews and their refusal to accept the gospel is a far cry from the radical genocide that the Nazis advocated in the early 20th century. Martin Luther died in 1946, and he is buried at the Castle Church in Wittenberg today, next to his cohort, Philip Melanchthon, who is also a very important reformer in Germany, instrumental, a brilliant linguist, and an important figure for the expansion of the Reformation in Germany after Luther's death. The Holy Roman Empire is divided as a result of this new Lutheran teaching, and so you have Catholic princes who have held to the Roman Catholic Church, and you've also have Protestant princes that have adopted Luther's teachings, and so the empire itself is often at war. Those Catholic princes form what's called the Catholic League, and the Protestant princes form what's called the Schmalkaldic League. The two sides fight each other, and realizing neither side is going to win, eventually the Peace of Augsburg is signed in 1555. This might be a date you could point to as a temporary end, at least, to religious conflict and the Reformation in Germany. And the prime decision of the Peace of Augsburg is this decision that Lutheranism and Catholicism, the split is recognized in the empire, and henceforth every prince will decide the religion for their area. It will be the prince to decide if the area will be Catholic or if the area will be Lutheran. This is a peace that holds for several decades to come, but then will be disrupted by the 30 Years' War. Charles V's empire is really torn apart by these emerging Lutheran ideas and foreign conflict abroad, and eventually he is going to abdicate his throne and retire to a monastery where he will die a few years later. Lutheranism doesn't just reside in the Holy Roman Empire, it also spreads to Scandinavia. And in Scandinavia, the monarchs of Denmark, Sweden, and Finland are influenced by reformers who have traveled to the Holy Roman Empire and have heard Lutheran ideas from Lutheran merchants. And as a result, monarchs in Scandinavia adopt Lutheranism and impose it on their populations as the official state church. This is true of Sweden, also Denmark, and Norway become official Lutheran countries and bastions of Lutheranism for centuries to come. The Reformation that occurs in Switzerland has a lot of similarities with Luther's Reformation in Germany, but there are also stark differences. Switzerland, like the Holy Roman Empire, is also this loose collection of what we call cantons, kind of states or provinces that made up this country that is loosely called Switzerland. There's really two prime areas of reform in Switzerland, one being Zurich and one being Geneva. The cantons in Switzerland are divided as well between Catholic cantons and Protestant cantons. And as a result, Switzerland will also be the scene of a lot of civil war and religious conflict. But to begin with the Protestant Reformation in Switzerland, we can first look at Zurich. There, the very capable pastor and theologian Ulrich Zwingli was the prime reformer. Zwingli was born in the mountains and well-educated, becomes famous for his expository preaching of moving through the scriptures instead of providing topical sermons and his own ideas. He's very famous as a pastor. The affair of the sausages took place in 1522 when Zwingli and some of his followers ate sausages during Lent. That action has been compared to burning the American flag. That was a way of protest against the authority of the Catholic Church, saying we are no longer following your rituals. Zwingli is very well known as a sympathetic and compassionate pastor, whereas most of the other pastors of Zurich fled with an outbreak of the plague. Zwingli remained and ministered to his congregation. A pivotal meeting took place in 1529 between Zwingli and the Reformed members of his church in Switzerland, meeting with Martin Luther and a group of Germans at Marburg in 1529. Here they hold a colloquy to identify if they're teaching the same things and could they unite this protesting effort to reform the church. After the meeting, the two sides agree on almost all articles regarding justification by faith alone and the authority of the scriptures and a rejection of purgatory and a lot of papal doctrines. The one sticking point that the two sides cannot agree upon is the Lord's Supper. Whereas Roman Catholics hold to a view of transubstantiation, the bread and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ, Lutherans hold to what is sometimes called consubstantiation, that the bread and the wine remain bread and wine, but also become the flesh and blood of Christ. And Zwingli will introduce a more memorialist idea in which it is simply a symbol. There is nothing supernatural, there is nothing spiritual occurring there in the Lord's Supper. So this point of disagreement does not lead to unification of the Reformed churches in Switzerland with the Lutheran ones. Despite Zwingli being a strong critic of the Swiss hiring themselves out as mercenaries to fight various wars, other people's wars, he is a pastor to many of these mercenaries, and he falls in battle, perishing. Eventually his enemies quarter his body and then burn it and feed it to pigs. Heinrich Bullinger is the very capable reformer who continued Zwingli's work after his death. The other very consequential reformer in Switzerland is John Calvin, who presides at the city-state of Geneva to the southwest in Switzerland. John Calvin, it's important to remember, was not Swiss, but rather he was French. He was born in Noyon, France. This is his house of birth and is now a Calvin museum. He was born of somewhat of a wealthy official, and he had received a benefice from a young age. That means he would get money from the established Catholic Church as long as he stayed in the good graces of the church. He, like Luther, was also in the process of studying to be a lawyer, studying the law. He was also something of a humanist scholar, and experiences a rather dramatic and sudden conversion in 1533. A very good friend of his was delivering the graduation address at the University of Paris that advocated for the reform movement, and eventually is going to lead to he and his friend being driven out of Paris in the middle of the night for the safety of their own lives. Another key event that leads to Calvin's fleeing from his native France is the affair of the Placards, in which reformers go throughout France putting up posters that criticize the Mass and the doctrine of transubstantiation. Someone had actually succeeded in putting one of these placards on the king's bedroom door. So the king felt very threatened, therefore issued edicts advocating for the persecution of the Protestants in France, leading to Calvin's escape from France. While on the run and eventually arriving in Basel, he writes the most significant book of the Reformation, and that is the Institutes of the Christian Religion. This is a summary of all Protestant doctrine. It is an effort, an apology for Protestant doctrine, to showing how what the Protestants were teaching actually extended from a clear teaching of the Scriptures, and that a lot of Protestant theology actually extended back into earlier church history before the early church had been corrupted by medieval Rome. This is going to be a work that Calvin is going to expand all of his life. It gets longer and longer as it goes along. There are going to be many different editions of it, but it teaches such doctrines as what do we know about God, knowing about Christ, what is the mode in obtaining the grace of Christ, what is the true church, and then other teachings. Calvin was quite content just to be a scholar and focus on his studies, but it is the very fiery William Farel that convinces John Calvin as he's passing through the city of Geneva that he must stay and help him. Calvin initially refuses. Farel issues a curse on him that if Calvin does not stay and help reform the church in Geneva, then all of his efforts will be fruitless. And so Calvin is so scared that he agrees to stay with Farel. And so they begin the reform of the church in Geneva. There's a strong Catholic and independent spirit, though, in in Geneva. And so eventually Calvin and Farel are kicked out of the city, exiled, and Calvin goes to Strasbourg. At Strasbourg, he meets the very famous Protestant reformer Martin Bucer, and Calvin becomes a pastor to a lot of the French refugees who had fled France from the persecution of the king. Calvin marries while he's at Strasbourg Idelette de Bure, who will bear him one child who unfortunately will die only a few days after his birth. While in Strasbourg, the Catholic Church sees an opportunity, now that Calvin is gone, to convert Geneva completely back to the Catholic Church. And so a very prominent Roman Catholic official, Cardinal Jacopo Satoletto, writes a letter endeavoring to get Geneva to convert back to the Catholic Church. Strangely enough, even though Geneva had kicked Calvin out of their city, they contact John Calvin in Strasbourg and ask him to deliver a reply to Satoletto. What Calvin writes is a very competent, erudite explanation of Protestant theology and rejection of the cardinal's teachings. The people of Geneva are so appreciative and so thankful that they invite Farel and Calvin back to the city in 1541, where Calvin will spend the rest of his life. Calvin picks up his preaching exactly where he had left off on the day of his banishment. Calvin preaches from this church, St. Pierre Cathedral in Geneva, expositing the scriptures for the rest of his life, and embarking upon the reform of the city of Geneva. Geneva really becomes a training ground, boot camp for a lot of Protestant refugees all throughout Europe, but particularly France, who are trained in Protestant theology and then return to their home countries as missionaries. A lot of that is occurring through the Geneva Academy, which was created by Calvin for the training of theological students, missionaries, and pastors. He would frequently lecture here, preach, teach classes, and so forth. Calvin is not immune to controversies like Luther. The two most famous controversies surrounding Calvin are the burning of Michael Servetus and his teaching of the doctrine of predestination. Calvin is often blamed for burning Michael Servetus. Sometimes this is grossly oversimplified, that Michael Servetus disagreed with John Calvin and therefore he burned him at the stake. That is categorically untrue. Michael Servetus was a heretic. He denied the Trinity, which was a heresy in everyone's book in the 16th century. He was under a death sentence by Roman Catholic authorities, but he had escaped. He had made his way to Geneva. He said he was going to start preaching his ideas of Unitarianism in Geneva and convert Calvin himself. It is city authorities, not Calvin, who arrested Servetus, put him on trial, condemned him to death, to burning. John Calvin worked extensively to convert Servetus, to have him give up his heretical ideas. John Calvin had no political power in the city of Geneva. He wasn't even a citizen until late in his life. He was not a government official. The church could only advise the city council, and then the city council could do it at once, which indeed it does burn Michael Servetus in 1553, although this is often blamed on Calvin. Calvin is also extensively criticized for teaching the doctrine of predestination. What's ironic about this is that Martin Luther wrote far more extensively about predestination than Calvin did. And St. Augustine, centuries before in the Middle Ages, had also written about predestination. And it's a teaching that goes back to the writings of the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans and also the book of Ephesians. So it is certainly not a doctrine that Calvin invented or came up with. He did write about it and probably most clearly articulated it. That's why it's often associated with his name. But he certainly was not the originator of the doctrine. Calvin gave very specific advice upon his death not to have his grave made into a shrine, and he wanted to be buried in an unmarked grave, and that's what occurs in Geneva. But this is the traditional gravesite of Calvin in Geneva. After Calvin's death, Theodore Beza is going to become one of the very significant leaders of the Reformation, continuing the Reformation in Geneva. Besides these magisterial reformations in which Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin are working with their local princes or working with the city council to effect the reformation of the church in their area, we can also identify another strain of reform movement in the church in the 16th century, but this was what we would call the Radical Reformation. The group most prominently associated with the Radical Reformation are the Anabaptists, or rebaptizers. The Anabaptists did not believe that the baptism of infants was biblical, and therefore they rejected it, and they would rebaptize adult converts. The Anabaptists also didn't believe in the authority of the state, often would not perform military service or submit to the authorities of the state, and also had questionable doctrines regarding the Trinity, frequently rejected the humanity of Christ, believing that Christ only remained God and only took on a version of celestial flesh that was not true humanity, which was, of course, heresy in the eyes a lot of the reformers. So prominent leaders among the Anabaptists include Conrad Grebel and also Felix Mons, who was drowned by the city council and Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich in 1527. The most notable radical Anabaptist leader of the 16th century was Thomas Müntzer. Müntzer corresponded with Luther and believed that Luther's Reformation didn't go far enough. Müntzer believed that the end of the world was at hand. He was very apocalyptic, and he advocated for the lower classes, the peasant class, the working class, to rise up against their landlords and against the authorities. This leads to the very violent outbreak of the German Peasants' War in 1524 to 1525. The peasants believe Luther is on their side, Luther disabuses them of that idea in 1525 by publishing a pamphlet against the robbing, murdering hordes of peasants, advocating for the princes to violently put down the rebellion. For Luther, the Reformation is not a violent event to take up arms against authorities as it is for Thomas Munster. Another significant Anabaptist rebellion is from the city of Munster in Germany, the Munster Rebellion of 1534-35. Here, two radical leaders, John Matthias and Jean van Leyden, proclaim a new Jerusalem. They're very apocalyptic, and they force the entire city to be rebaptized. They reject the celebration of the Lord's Supper, impose communal redistribution of all wealth and property, and encourage polygamy. This is one of the first occasions in which Protestant and Catholic soldiers allied together to put down this radical rebellion, eventually leading to the execution of its leaders and the slaughter of many participants in the rebellion. The Anabaptist movement is eventually reorganized and becomes much more pacifist under the teachings of Menno Simons. Menno Simons, of course, is the inspiration for the two groups that will prominently come to colonial America, the Amish and the Mennonites. Perhaps no other area of Europe was so torn apart and destroyed due to religious conflict in the 16th century than France, where we can turn now. France, particularly due to the fact that there's a very weak monarchy in the latter half of the 16th century, is really destroyed by religious conflict. That's going to have implications for the coming centuries after the 16th century. Let's remember that John Calvin was French himself, so he has a heart for his countrymen in sharing the gospel and seeing the expansion of the Reformed Church there. So the Geneva Academy in Geneva was, in many ways, specifically designed to train pastors and missionaries to go back to France, these French refugees, and to convert their fellow countrymen. These Protestants in France are known as the Huguenots, French Protestants often meeting in secret. One of the earliest French Protestants was Pierre Viret, a good friend of John Calvin, who is reported to have preached to thousands in Paris and Orléans and Avignon and Montpellier, and converting hundreds and thousands of French men and women to the Reformed faith. As a result, particularly of the affair of the Placards, when these posters are posted around Paris criticizing the Mass, including on the door of the bedroom of the king responds by issuing edicts persecuting the Huguenots. The Edict of Fontainebleau, which identified Huguenots as heretics, the Edict of Chateaubriand, which censored and confiscated their property, and the Edict of Compiègne, which provided the death penalty for heretics and those linked to Geneva. As a result, the Huguenots become a secret group in France, often meeting in caves, forests, mountains, meadows. They printed very small Bibles, including this New Testament that could be pinned up in a lady's hair bun. Also, this beer barrel that could pop up and convert to a pulpit so that they could meet and worship secretly and privately. So Calvin is instrumental in encouraging, promoting the reform and the conversion of many other French citizens. He introduces in his writings this idea of the right of resistance, that when the true church of God, that French men and women should submit to their French authorities, to the king. But when the king persecutes the true church of God, then the true believers have a right to resist. This right of resistance gradually morphs into some of the writings of the Monarchomaques. The Monarchomaques were these group of Huguenot writers who wrote against tyranny and tyrants and introduced very important concept of the contractual theory of government. Later, what's to be called the social contract. The contractual theory of government declared that government is a contract between the governors, and the governed. And the governors are supposed to protect the people, and the people are supposed to obey the governors. But when the governors, particularly the king, fails in his duty and persecutes the true church, it is no longer the responsibility of the people to be obedient to their king, and they have a right to resist or to rebel. So here we have in the Reformation, particularly in the writings of Philip de Mornay and Theodore Beza, this idea of the contract theory of government, which of course is going to be very important during the Enlightenment and of course the basis of the United States Declaration of Independence. A key military leader of the Huguenots at mid-century is Admiral Coligny. Coligny is very interested in protecting the Huguenots. At one point endeavors to resettle hundreds of them at Fort Caroline, which is very close to Jacksonville, Florida. But having failed in this expedition, continues to advocate for their defense and protection in France. The King of France, for much of the first half of the 16th century, is a very strong king. This is Francis I, who is famously friends then enemies with Henry VIII of England. There's a time that Francis I seemed to be very interested in the Reformed faith, and there are many that speculate that he was considering converting to Protestantism. But his reign is really racked by a large international war, the Habsburg-Valois Wars, between Germany and his own monarchy. And a key event signaling that Francis I is not interested in the Reformed faith was the affair of the Placards. He feels that his life is at jeopardy, therefore he starts issuing edicts against the Huguenots. One of the first areas to be targeted for persecution of the Huguenots is in the Alps. And that is where the descendants of a lot of the Waldensians were still residing. You have the very famous massacre of Merindal in 1545, in which Huguenot men, women, and children were thrown from the mountains, being persecuted for their faith. After Francis I in France, we have Henry II, very famous king who continued to persecute the Protestants. He marries Catherine de' Medici, who is an Italian princess, and she will bear him several sons. Henry II was much more concerned with his mistress, the very famous Diane de Poitiers, who is famous for drinking gold and liquid gold, than he was being an effectual ruler. So when Henry II dies in 1559, this leaves his wife, Catherine de' Medici, as the nominal ruler of France, because even though a succession of her sons are ruling over the kingdom, she is the one really controlling each of her sons. Catherine de' Medici is a very devout Catholic and a very devout persecutor of the Huguenots. She earns the nickname Le Serpent, the snake, from the Huguenots. And Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III are the three kings presiding over France during the late 16th century, but they are all weak, ineffectual, emotionally disturbed, and not effective for resolving the division in the country. The real power in the country is a combination of Catherine de' Medici, but also the two sides in the French Wars of Religion, this French Civil War over religion. These are the Huguenots, whose emerging leader is Henry Bourbon, who is the King of Navarre. His mother was a devout Huguenot. He was not, but realizing it's the basis of his political power over the small kingdom of Navarre, which was between France and Spain, then he adopts Protestant thinking himself, and he is the nominal leader of the Huguenots, this outlaw group in France. Much larger group is controlled by the Catholic League. Henry I, Duke of Guise, he is not an heir to the throne. He would very much like to be, but he has essentially his own army, often the ear of the queen, and he is very focused on the destruction of the Huguenot cause. good example of that is the tragic massacre at Vassy in 1562, in which Huguenots who are worshiping in a barn have the doors closed, and then the barn is burned down with the worshipers inside. In an effort to resolve the conflict of the French Wars of Religion, Catherine de' Medici proposes a marriage between Henry Bourbon, the leader of the Huguenots, to her daughter, Marguerite de Valois. So the marriage is arranged for these two, which is supposed to heal the division in the country. And the wedding, is to be celebrated on St. Bartholomew's Day in Paris. As a result, thousands of Huguenots come across the country to reside in Paris, when it turns out that the wedding was a trap. It was a setup. And the queen, along with the instigation of her sadistic son, orders the butchery of the Huguenots who are staying in Paris for the wedding. And this leads to the very famous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. Admiral Coligny is one of those massacred, thrown out of his window where he was staying, in fact. And throughout the streets of Paris, there are hundreds and then thousands of Huguenots slain in the streets, heads, limbs often thrown into the Seine River. Eyewitnesses said the Seine River ran red with blood. Henry Bourbon barely escapes with his life, but only because he agrees to convert to Catholicism. Once he leaves Paris, he revokes his conversion. And this leads to even more bitter civil war between the French Protestants and the Catholics in France, with complete distrust of the monarchy. When it's all said and done, thousands upon thousands of Huguenots are slaughtered in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. After the massacre, we have another stage in the French Wars of Religion that is sometimes called the War of the Three Henrys, because it involves Henry, Duke of Guise, who is the leader of the Catholic League, Henry III, who was the Valois heir to the throne and then eventually king from 1574 to 1589, and Henry Bourbon, who's the leader of the Huguenots. So three Henrys essentially at war with each other. Eventually, Henry, the Duke of Guise, is assassinated, and Henry III dies of illness in 1589. This leaves the nearest heir to the throne, the individual with the greatest claim to the throne through his lineage, being Henry Bourbon, who is, of course, the leader of the Huguenots. So this is a significant problem for France. France, which is still overwhelmingly a Catholic country, now the heir to the throne is the leader of this Protestant insurgency. And so, although he didn't actually say the words, the phrase that's connected with Henry Bourbon at this moment is "Paris is worth a mass." In other words, it is worth converting again to Catholicism in order to become king of France, which is what he does in 1589, becoming Henry IV, the first Bourbon monarch of France. Now, converting to Catholicism secures his throne, but of course it alienates all his supporters in Navarre and across France, or the Huguenots. So, as a sop to pacify his former supporters, one of the first things that Henry IV does as king is issue the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes provided 20 free cities in which Huguenots could arm themselves with weapons and worship freely. Cities like La Rochelle and also Nantes become bastions of the Huguenots where they will reside for the next several decades. So we can perhaps date the end of the French Wars of Religion in 1598 with the issuance of the Edict of Nantes. Henry IV is later assassinated in his carriage. Eventually, the Edict of Nantes will be repealed by Louis XIV in the following century, leading to mass conversions, additional persecution, or thousands of Huguenots emigrating to the Americas, particularly the Carolinas. There's very little Reformation in Italy. That is, of course, because this is the home field of the Pope himself and the Papal States. There is some Reformed activity in the north, in the city of Lucca, particularly under the leadership of Peter Martyr Vermigli. We also have some Waldensians in the Italian Alps Girolamo Savonarola was a very famous and fiery leader of a brief Reformation in Florence. But there's very little Reformation in Italy itself, apart from the brilliant scholarship of Peter Martyr Vermigli. There's also very little or no Reformation in Spain as well. Spain, and particularly Philip II, views itself as a fortress of Catholicism that exists to defend the Pope and expand the Catholic Church, which of course they're doing into the New World. Philip II consolidates the empire and is forming colonies, particularly in Central and South America. But he believes he's on a personal mission to fight Protestantism. He achieves this title of most Catholic of princes from the Pope. And you can see he's expanding his army across in the New World with these large treasure fleets coming back to Spain. Philip II scores a significant naval victory at the Battle of Lepanto, in which he defeats the Muslim navy of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. So with this major naval victory, Philip II believes his naval forces are invincible. For a brief period of time, he is married to Mary I, Mary Tudor of England. But what primarily concerns much of Philip's reign is the Dutch Reformation and the Dutch Revolt. What occurs in the Netherlands during the Reformation is really a combination of a war for independence, but also a war for reform of the church. The two go hand in hand in the Netherlands. The Low Countries, the Dutch people, had been part of the Habsburg Empire, the Empire of Charles V, and had been inherited as part of the dominions of Philip II. But they chafed under Spanish rule, Spanish Catholic rule, very far away, and often the oppressive rule of the local Spanish magistrates. And so it leads to their revolt in the second part of the 16th century, seeking their independence as an independent country, but also the reform of the church. We can date the beginnings of the Dutch Reformed Church to a large degree with the work of Guy de Brès. Guy de Brès was the very inspirational writer of the Belgic Confession. De Brès sent a copy of the Belgic Confession to John Calvin himself to have it edited, and he writes a very famous letter to his wife from prison anticipating his death, which indeed occurs in 1567, his execution by Spanish authorities. So it is the Dutch that rise up against Spanish authority, not only political authority, but also the reform of the church. In 1566, we see these large outbreaks of Dutch men and women going into Catholic churches, smashing idols and the traditional symbols of papal authority and Catholic theology, particularly saints and statues of the Virgin Mary, called Beeldenstorm, the destruction of these statues. This will lead to what is often called the 80 Years' War, an 80-year campaign to secure the independence of a Dutch republic as well as the reform of the Dutch church. The very brutal oppressor of the Dutch is the Duke of Alba, who's a Spanish general who is famous for his oppression of the Dutch people, for his willingness to raze whole towns, massacre innocent civilians. He had established what were known as the Council of Troubles. These were impromptu courts that you could be accused, tried, convicted, and executed within the same day. This, of course, embitters much of the Dutch population against Spanish authority, and their entire cities and villages, including Oudewater, which were destroyed by the Spanish in acts of reprisals against Dutch defiance. One of the prime leaders in the Dutch revolt was William of Orange. Orange is one of these royal families that claim royal authority over much of the Netherlands. And he's a very significant leader of a group of Dutch rebels that particularly operated along the sea, known as the Sea Beggars. The Sea Beggars had these very small, manageable, quick ships that could attack the larger Spanish galleons. And so the war for independence takes place along the coast on the seas as well as it does in Dutch villages and towns. The Dutch sign what is known as the Act of Abjuration in 1581. This is another statement of the contract theory of government during the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. So again, here we see this idea that because the authorities have not protected the people have a right to resist and right to rebel in demonstration of this contract theory of government. Finally, in 1579, we have a bit of a truce in the 80 Years' War with the Union of Arras, which were the southern provinces of the Netherlands, form a Catholic union. Much of this area will eventually, in 1830, become the country of Belgium. And in 1579, the Union of Utrecht, which were the northern, more Calvinist Dutch states, form the Dutch Republic. So the Union of Utrecht is very significant in the formation of the Dutch Republic. And for a brief period of time here, it seems that indeed the Dutch will be independent. Dutch independence will not be completely secured until the Treaty of Westphalia, which ends the 30 Years' War in 1648. Very significant theological development occurs in the Netherlands with the teachings of Jacobus Arminius. Arminius started to advocate ideas of what will eventually become known as Arminianism, which is the idea, it's almost a complete rejection of Calvinism and Reformed theology. It is the belief that man is not totally corrupt, not completely sinful, that he has a choice whether or not he accepts God's grace or not, and he needs to exercise his own free will in order to accept God's grace, and then in order not to lose his salvation, continually needs to demonstrate a holy lifestyle in order to be saved. And so this is a stark rejection of a lot of what Calvin had written in the Institutes of the Christian Religion. So Dutch Reformed church authorities convene at the Synod of Dort. And at Dort, they issued the Canons of Dort, which reject Arminian teaching and Arminian theology, although this group of teachings will continue for many years to come. Finally, we can mention a bit about the Reformation in Eastern Europe. There's less impact by the Protestant Reformation in Eastern Europe. It is significant for a brief moment of time in Poland with the efforts of the reformer Jan Helaski. Jan Helaski was a Polish theologian who promoted the Reformation not only in his home country of Poland, but also England. He was heavily influenced by Erasmus and Zwingli. And he succeeds in getting the monarch to convert much of Poland to the Protestant church. And hundreds and thousands of Poles convert to Protestantism. But it is Poland that is the only example of a country that converts to Catholicism, that converts to the Protestant teachings, and then reverts back. The Jesuits, who we'll discuss in a moment, send many of their troops into Poland, and they succeed in converting the country back to Catholicism. So we could say that Poland is the only country where the Reformation fails, where there is an emerging Protestant church, but then it does not survive. There are other reformers in Eastern Europe, including Jiří Trnavský, who is known as the Luther of the Slavs, influencing in converting large parts of Eastern Europe, including Slovenia. Also, Gaspar Koroli, who is a Hungarian Calvinist pastor who is influential, particularly in Hungary. This is a review of the Protestant Reformation and the continent of Europe. In the next lecture review, we'll review the Reformation in England and in Scotland.